4. This is Mark Lieberman, the host of The World According to Mark, brought to you through WPVM FM in Asheville, North Carolina, 103.7 on your dial, and streaming globally on WPVMFM.org. My guest today is Professor Robert Shrode, who is an assistant professor of political science at the University of North Carolina in Asheville. And I've asked him to come on to talk about polarization in the political process, and spills over into much more. And I want to thank Rob for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So what are we here to talk about? We are talking about the times that we're living in terms of what some people call partisan politics, extreme politics, the left-right divide, the urban-rural divide, the black-white divide, the divide. And I've been thinking about this issue for a long time, as I do in terms of many of my political shows and politics that I read and discuss with others. And it obviously is clear that we are living in times which try men's souls. And I wish I knew what that was from, so I would give credit to the author. But it is times where there is a lot of angst, a lot of frustration about how our democracy is working or not working, problems that we have in terms of respect for law and order, the media, and so on and so forth. And then I found out that Professor Shrode was actually teaching a course on this. And so I'm happy to have you on. And why don't you tell us, you've been at UNCA as an assistant professor for a couple of years?
Yeah, since January of 2019.
And before that, where were you?
I was at UCLA for a few years. I did my graduate degree there, got my PhD from UCLA, and then I taught there and at Santa Monica College for a couple of years afterwards.
Okay. So within the realm of political science, you're teaching something about, again, this concept of polarization. So I guess we should probably start out talking about what is polarization. Then we'll talk a little bit about what your course is intended to do in terms of its education of the students at UNCA. What is polarization?
Well, that's a big question. I think the way, for the purposes of our discussion, it makes sense to think about it is sort of the gap between the two political parties. And that gap can arise because people's attitudes within each party become more and more extreme, but it can also arise through a process called sorting, where people's attitudes in one party become more and more consistent. So if you were to look back, for instance, to the 1960s, to the 1970s, what you would see is that someone's identity as, say, a Republican would not be very predictive of their position on abortion or their position on immigration issues or on racial issues. And you would see the same thing with Democrats. And today, more and more consistently, whether it's in the legislature or even now within the populace, if you have that identity, that party identity, you tend to consistently take positions that line up with other partisans. So you almost think about people becoming almost more stereotypically Republican or stereotypically Democrat.
So let me ask you a question about that, because obviously, again, we're talking fundamentally about polarization as it pertains to politics. And you've already mentioned the Republican Democrat divide. I take your point that there have been historically members of the Republican Party that have not been vehemently against abortion, and there are representatives of the Democratic Party, just as an example, who are supportive of the interpretation of what the Second Amendment means as far as carrying guns and so on and so forth. But if you add one other factor to that, let's just talk geography, and you're talking about Democrats in the South, but then Republicans in the South. Let's bring it up to more contemporary times. And you didn't ask what a particular politician from one of the old Confederacy states, to use that term, what would their position be regarding gun rights and regarding abortion rights. I think it'd be pretty close to being able to identify that. So it's not, maybe it's more pronounced today. Maybe it's more extreme in terms of how people sort, to use your term, but it was still somewhat predictive if you knew what their party was and what their geography was. Would you agree with that?
Well, there are a lot of political scientists that would actually even argue that we didn't have a two-party system before the Southern realignment, that you functionally had two different Democratic parties at one point. But that is part of this story. So certainly you get more traction if you add region onto party, but you still see that, generally speaking, people's political views were not lined up on a left-right conservative spectrum in the way that they are today. That spectrum existed, but it was really a spectrum that was utilized almost exclusively by elites, and that the average person just did not have consistent positions on these issues. And a lot of that had to do with elite messaging. If you had Southern Democrats taking conservative positions on racial and economic issues, and you had Northern Democrats taking liberal positions on these issues, then if you're not paying much attention to politics, you're kind of left not getting the cue from your party, or you're getting conflicting cues to some degree. And so your issue positions end up looking like conflicting issue positions when you line them up on that left-right spectrum.
Well, in today's world, and I mean actually today, as you're indicating, we're living through the politics of extreme, where there is a polarity or polarization. We can see that in many ways, but let's just talk about what we're seeing in the US Congress these days, which is that there tend to be 50 Democrats who are looking at things one way in the House, and 50 Republicans looking another way in the Senate. We've got, we say that in fact the House and the Senate are both in control of the Democrats, but that's in many ways a fiction. It's the thinnest thread essentially that allows that to even happen, but that's if everybody completely lines up. So given the composition, any piece of legislation that comes up, if it is characterized or seen as a liberal piece of legislation, like something to do with, again, what people call the soft infrastructure these days, or the social welfare net, or if it has something to do with reversing changes that are occurring at the state level in terms of elections, or if it comes into issues like reproductive rights or guns, you pretty much know that you're going to have a solid block of either party lining up on either side of that, and no real attempt and no real effort made to sort of bridge the gap. And I find, to some extent, and I want you to speak on it, the calls for bipartisanship is almost laughable in the context of what we're looking at, because you can't have, it would seem to me, bipartisanship with a degree of polarization that we're experiencing. What's your view about that?
Well, so I think politicians are generally responsive to the pressures that they're under. And the way our system is set up today with these popular primaries um, as the nomination contests, people's feet, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, the politicians' feet is really held to the fire. And one of the things you've frequently seen that's causing this to get worse is that moderate members of the parties are getting primaried out by individuals who are seen as more extreme, or people who the activists within the party actually prefer, because those are the voters in the primaries. And you saw this with, for instance, Joe Crowley in New York, who was seen as potentially the heir apparent to Nancy Pelosi, and then is beat by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. You saw it several years back with Eric Cantor in kind of a similar situation. So I think, yeah, this is being driven by a lot of pressure where activists don't want to see oftentimes members of their party cooperating with members of the other party. A second insight, I think, that really plays into this is the recognition that in US politics, most voters aren't paying close attention, and the president's party generally gets all the credit for anything good that happens and all the blame for anything bad that happens. So even if you do want a policy to be passed as, say, a Republican right now, you might take the position that you want that policy passed, but not when Joe Biden's president. I sometimes, as a kind of a mental exercise, I was thinking the other day about Bill Clinton and the fact that after he lost the 94 midterms by such a large margin, he pivoted and worked on what many
after the Democratic Party lost in the midterms. So he still was in office, but he lost the majority. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, thank you for clarifying there. He pivoted to work on some Republican goals, welfare reform, balancing the budget, and Newt Gingrich was happy to oblige him on those issues. I honestly don't know that we would see Mitch McConnell act in a similar fashion today, simply because he might want to just deny Joe Biden anything that might be considered a win.
So in the examples that you're citing, we're saying that there was a time not so very long ago, although I guess it's been 25 years or more since Bill Clinton was president, that some Republicans, and Newt Gingrich was obviously an ardent conservative Republican, would have been happy to get certain policy objectives accomplished through compromise and working with a Democratic president, and would not be worried about, well, if I'm doing this, how's it going to be seen to from the base? But in today's world, even that ability to use policy issues as a way of getting a bipartisan result doesn't work if to me, it's not just the polarization. It's the only thing that matters is retaining control, being reelected, being in a majority status, or in Mitch McConnell's case, he's in the minority by a bare minority, but because of the filibuster, which allows the minority to block legislative advances, it's really just a question of, we're not going to let, and from Mitch McConnell's vantage point, I guess, we're just not going to let the Democrats get their way, even if it's something that we would agree with.
Yeah, it is really, it's hard for me to say that definitely wouldn't happen, but that feels true to me. I think that it's likely that McConnell would not compromise even to get policy items that he might want. And political scientists tend to always think of politicians as people who first and foremost care about re-election. We think of them as just people who have jobs and they just want to keep their jobs. The difference has become that as polarization has increased, the cost of working with the other side, of being seen as someone who might be helping the other side, I think has become higher for politicians. It's more of an electoral threat now than it used to be.
My guest today is Professor Robert Shrode from the University of North Carolina, Asheville. He's a professor, assistant professor in political science, and we're talking about the concept of polarization. Professor Shrode is teaching a course on it, and we're trying to talk about what does it mean. And I was looking at your syllabus, and you introduce the students to the course through the, I'm looking at the outline. It says the US is at a tipping point and political interactions are increasingly filled with resentment and acrimony. You talk about debates leaving us with a sense of decreased consensus. And you talk about how this spills into discussions of substantive issues such as COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, and the 2020 elections. And then you go on to say that you're going to discuss this with the students, but that some of this is not new, and that there are ways to sort of reverse course, which is an optimistic note. I guess you might have to say that, otherwise you wouldn't get anybody taking your course, because people don't want to be, they're okay to feel bad for the first part of the semester, but not the whole semester. So let me let you comment on that, as again, sort of maybe now that you're into the course, how that has worked out in terms of your discussion. And this is a good time for you to mention that one of the primary source materials for this is a book written by Ezra Klein, who's a journalist and many other things. And he wrote a book that came out in 2020 called Why We're Polarized. So a comment again on sort of where you have been in this course and how it's playing out in terms of the discussions.
So yeah, I think the unfortunate reality for most social scientists is we're the kind of see ourselves as the potential doctors for the society, and that means we stare at the wounds of society a lot. And one of the things I've consciously moved to doing in my own research and teaching is to try to find some of the positive aspects of things. So I definitely think we're at a tipping point. I think some of the demographic factors behind polarization in the past and today are things like immigration, some of the changes, like I mentioned, that Southern realignment where Democrats in the South were kind of replaced by Republican politicians in the South. So we've got all of these factors that are coming together to sort of set the stage for a politics that's potentially really problematic. And, you know, ultimately, I don't know that the forces of good will win, but I am always looking to find how they're working, where they're working. And one of the things that I talk to my students about is a type of political communication called deep canvassing. So
say that again. What kind of canvassing?
It's called deep canvassing.
Deep. Okay, gotcha.
So people who study political communication have found that, generally speaking, political messaging is woefully ineffective when it comes to changing people's minds. When people have political arguments, they're typically not really open to changing their opinion on an issue. And you can't argue someone into a position by having better evidence most of the time. So if I'm providing a lot of statistical evidence to you, I can have an overwhelming amount. Most people will just let it kind of wash over them. And if anything, they'll leave having doubled down on their position. It's almost like it's an excuse for you to come up with counter arguments to me and therefore be more strong in your position. But there are people who've been working to try to decrease levels of discrimination in the United States, both on LGBT issues, but also on immigration issues. And what they have found is that listening in a non-judgmental fashion to someone else's personal narratives and then sharing your personal narratives or even someone else's personal narratives can be a really effective way or to reduce the amount of discrimination and exclusionary attitudes. And so if you were to just Google deep canvassing, some of this will pop up. There's a good TED talk on it that I show in my class. And so what I work on with the students is learning how to listen to people on the other side of the political aisle and then actually represent those ideas. Because if you understand where people are coming from and you give them the credit of generally being decent human beings who aren't trying to cause harm most of the time to other people, at least consciously, then you've got sort of the basis for a form of communication that involves mutual respect. And eventually with deep canvassing, what you're trying to do is get them to perspective take. So when you're trying to get someone to maybe have more compassionate positions on immigration issues, you might talk to them about what undocumented people in the United States deal with, but also you might ask them at some point a question like, is there a time where you really needed someone to be there for you or be compassionate towards you, and they did? Can you tell me a little bit about that, right? And then you can start to draw the links between their personal experience and the personal experience of someone who's been in a different situation.
Well, let me pause for a second on this, Professor. And you're talking about the issues of polarization and having rational discussions. And you're talking about it from the standpoint of people, the electorate.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like, again, my reading of Ezra Klein's book on why we're polarized, he seems to suggest it's a manipulation on the part of the politicians themselves. Yes, there's sentiment that folks have based upon their identity, how they see themselves as Republican or Democrat, liberal or conservative, whatever. But maybe this is a more cynical view. I don't think the politicians, when they talk and when they talk through some of these issues, they're trying to take your guns away if we're talking about Second Amendment or abortion. We have to stop the pro-abortionists from allowing abortion on demand. I don't think that the politicians are talking about their views, and I don't think they're necessarily trying to reflect the views of their constituents. I think that they are oversimplifying, dumbing down the discussion, and simply using those issues as wedge issues in order to solidify the polarization to allow them to get elected. And just one more line here is, you mentioned that, obviously one of the things that politicians tend to want to do is they tend to want to get reelected. But it seems like in the past, some folks would say, I want to get reelected because this is what I believe in and what I think my constituents want, whereas you can leave out all that. It's just, I want to get elected. And for those people that don't have that point of view, they're not even running again. You see bunches of Democrats and Republicans who are unhappy about what's going on. Those are people apparently who do care about policy and issues, and you're left with hardcore folks that will say whatever it takes to gin up acrimony and create the polarization. What's your reaction to that?
So certainly I think politicians are incentivized to really increase anger, because when you increase people's anger, when you increase fear, you increase their willingness to participate in politics. And so I see some of that elite level messaging as really negatively impacting this sort of polarization. Uh, the thing I would say is I take a more cynical attitude, I think, on the motives of politicians historically. So I think a lot of I will agree there are some politicians out there who really do care about policy and issues, but I would argue that a lot of the retirements we see by people who are moderates today, who maybe seem to be more principled on these policy issues, I would actually say that mostly what we're seeing are people who realize in the next primary election, they're likely to face a challenger from within their own party who's more extreme, who will beat them in the primary, because the vast majority of the population doesn't vote in these primaries. The people who do tend to be the most engaged in politics, and politics is kind of like football. If you pay a little bit of attention to politics, like maybe you know a few things about the way the game is played, but you maybe don't have a team that you're really rooting for. But if you watch every week, whether it's the Sunday morning Fox News show or the NFL, like you, after a while, you pick a team, and the more rabid you get, the more in football, the more money you spend on jerseys or whatever it is, you know, season tickets. But in politics, the more you donate, the more likely you are to come out to vote in these primary contests. So as a result, I think what you see is a lot of moderates who realize that they're going to lose. And so instead of fighting a battle they think they can't win, they just decide to step away.
Which again is just sort of further corroboration of the extent of the polarization, because the moderates don't feel safe and don't feel as if they're ever going to accomplish anything. Mm-hmm. And let's not overlook the fact that people who are not towing the line for their particular party, I think it's probably both Republicans and Democrats, but you hear about it more on the Republican side. Liz Cheney's decision to vote in favor of impeachment and so on and so forth. These people's physical well-being is being challenged, and so you know there's a point in which the price to serve your country and to continue on in the political realm is too high if you're going to subject yourself and your family to possibly menacing or worse. So that I think further gives support to what you're saying, Professor. Again, I'm talking to Rob Shrode, professor at the University of North Carolina in Asheville in political science, talking about politics, generally polarization, and where we are and where we may be going. I wanted to ask you, it seems to me that Ezra Klein's book, and maybe what you're suggesting as well through your course, is that as difficult as things are now, as much as our democratic institutions seem to be threatened, you know, transition of power after an election, the sanctity of the elections themselves, free speech, so on and so forth. Mr. Klein seems to argue this is not new. We have been here before, but at the same time, he brings up situations that show, yes, we've been here before, but now we seem to be even more stuck in this polarization. So how do you reconcile what seems to me to be somewhat of conflicting views about having been here before, but yes, we're at a tipping point and it's actually worse, and the threats are graver, and if something doesn't change, that we could see our democratic institutions just disappear?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to the way most people are interacting with politics, we only have data going back into the middle of the 20th century on this, in the way that I study things, which is largely through public opinion surveys. But most people have identified through a sense of identity. And there is some evidence that you can see this going all the way back into the 19th century. Like if you look at political ads for the president in the middle of the 19th century, what you'll learn is that every political candidate for president, major party candidate, was born in a log cabin, right? Which is obviously not the case. Most of them—
A condo of log cabins. Okay, go ahead.
yeah, but it was an identity message, right? And you look into the middle of the 20th century, oftentimes it's things like occupation. If you're a union worker, then you identify with the Democratic Party. And today, those identities really have become very closely tied in with partisanship. So I can use your other identities, whether it's your sexual orientation or your race or your ethnicity or your gender, to increasingly predict your party identity. And as these party identities become what we're starting to call mega identities, you actually see that the stakes rise for everyone, because humans are kind of designed to protect their group and do what's best for their group, even when they have to, in some cases, sacrifice their life for that group. And so you're getting these very primal sort of reactions that pop up. We have been in similar circumstances before. Before the Civil War, you see similar circumstances. I think the one big thing we have going for us that's different than in the 1850s is that there isn't a clear dividing line between cities and rural areas in the way that there was a clear dividing line between the Confederate states and the northern states. In the 1920s, you see a lot of this stuff pop up in response to immigration specifically. So one of the things that seems to cause this sort of acrimony is when the proportion of the population that's white starts to approach 50%. So as we get close to that point where whites don't make up a clear majority of the country anymore.
Reduction of the white percentage is what you're saying.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So in that case, what you see is a lot of increase in Confederate statues being put up in some places in the 1920s. You see the "No Irish Need Apply" signs pop up. And, you know, the way that was kind of went away over time was that Irish and Italian populations, which were the largest immigrant populations at the time, were brought into this category of white. I'm not suggesting we should do something similar today, certainly, because what you see is really harsh marginalization of the Black population as a result. And in the one place that gives me hope is that you see similar circumstances in the state of California in the 1990s, as the state of California is about to move into being a majority minority state. And in the mid-90s, you can look back to ballot propositions that were so extreme that, well, one of them wanted to deny access to K through 12 education to undocumented children. This would have essentially not only marginalized that population to an incredible degree, but it also would have caused a serious burden on the rest of the state of California, as they had people who were not educated as adults and didn't have real economic opportunity. I mean, these are children that could become taxpayers, and you're trying to prevent them from doing that by passing this bill. And it won on a ballot proposition. The majority of voters voted for it. It didn't become law because a judge struck it down afterwards. But if you look at the state of California today, which you see as a majority minority state, and I'm not arguing that California is some racial and ethnic panacea, but I think that things are a little bit calmer there than they are in some other parts of the country on those fronts right now. And so California is an example where maybe after you move past that 50%, and people see that the world doesn't fall apart, that maybe there can be a sort of return to normalcy a bit. And
So I get your point. But I think, I can hear a lot of folks arguing that California is not emblematic at all of the rest of the country. I mean, there are people that think that California should be forced to secede from the Union. And I give you another paradigm example of what I think people would argue. Take a state like Texas, which in terms of sheer numbers, people are saying they're already at a point in which whites, whatever white means these days, are not a majority, or they're close to falling below the line. You've got a rise in the Hispanic population, not as big a rise, but an increase in African-American population. And yet the idea that they could pass any kind of the social engineering or pro-social progressive legislation that has passed in California, I don't see that as happening. And before you comment, I just want to say that the population is going to change. You can't stop, the push, essentially, unless you absolutely close off the borders entirely or start making prohibitions on how many family people can, how large a family can be. That will change. But there are levers that it would appear to me that the Republicans have no difficulty in using to try to constrain the participation by the non-white population in elections. And our system is set up in such a way that whether it's based on urban versus rural or whatever, that it might be years, presumably decades, before things actually change just because of the changes in the population composition. What's your view about that?
I mean, certainly the change in population composition argument is a long game argument. We're not looking, I think it's about a generation before you'll actually see the US become a majority minority nation. And even then, political power tends to lag these population changes, because in that situation, the population that would be today considered like BIPOC or Black, Indigenous people of color would be disproportionately young. And you can't vote in the country until you're 18. Even then, younger people who are voting eligible don't vote at the same rates as people in their 40s, 50s, and it continues to increase into your 60s. And that's something that's been stable over time, is that younger people are there's a life cycle effect here. So political power will likely lag these demographic changes. I don't necessarily, but when I think of, say, social policy and social welfare policies, I see that as somewhat orthogonal to this population.
You're gonna have to explain orthogonal,
Okay,
because unless that's
I will.
an equilateral triangle mixed with an octagon, I don't know what it is.
I will define it. So basically, sorry, I think in terms of math sometimes when it comes to these models, but I guess what I'm saying is I think that we could see a reduction in polarization, but that might not result in increased, say, social welfare policies in the United States. As people become more moderate, they aren't necessarily going to become more economically progressive. We'll see. It's a possibility, but I don't see the two as being related.
Okay. Let me talk about another element of this polarization, or at least another indication of it. Again, looking at Ezra Klein's book, which again was source material for your course. What he talks about again is the extreme examples of how, if you're a Democrat, you're a Democrat not necessarily because you love the Democratic Party, but because you hate the Republican Party, or you vote for a Democrat not because you like that particular politician, but you hate the politician who's running for the opposite party, the Republican Party. And he mentions something which is a relatively recent phenomenon, that there used to be such a thing as ticket splitting, where you'd vote for a Democrat and as a Republican, but you'd vote for, Democrat is for president, or you vote for a Republican for governor or senate. And he says, at least, that has sort of gone away, and it's gone away again for the reasons I just mentioned, that people are so partisan, stringent, that's the only way they think. They think every Democrat is bad, or every Republican is bad. And that again suggests to me that we're going to be in this what I think is destructive polarization for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a good chance that this is what things look like, or things actually even look more polarized, say 10 years from now. What I try to encourage people to look at is towards local politics, where you see less of this polarization today, and also where individuals can have a much larger impact on what the political outcomes actually are, particularly if you live in a smaller city or a rural area. Oftentimes those elections are determined by tens of votes or hundreds of votes. And in those kinds of situations, becoming a political activist might mean the difference between, a politician that you agree with getting access to office, and one you disagree with gaining access to office. So, I'm still kind of hopeful that if we can get back to a more localized concept of politics, that maybe we can combat some of this polarization. The other thing that the evidence shows is that people who are actually involved in politics tend to be maybe not the politicians themselves and taking positions on issues, but the people at the ground level tend to be a little bit more moderate. And it's because you oftentimes have to work with people who you disagree with, or who hold identities that you might associate with the other party in order to get something done. So actually getting involved in that persuasion machine, I think, can be a moderating aspect in and of itself. When you're staring at someone across a table or on their front porch, it's harder to deny their humanity than when you're getting on a social media platform, say, and arguing back against something that you see in a post.
Well, isn't also a part of that local versus national, that and maybe this is what you're saying, the issues as discussed at the national level, let's just take an example like we talked before we came on air, climate change. I mean, that is such a huge thing. You got to talk about what is climate change, how much of it is caused by what is man-made, what's the dynamics if we change national policy and move away from fossil fuels towards something else, and what about our competitors, and so on and so forth. But if you talk about climate change issue at a local level, you're talking about the immediate impact of floods and fires and changes, different seasonal changes that wipe people out. And even people who you would expect to be on one side or the other side of the political spectrum are not thinking politics. If a farmer loses his or her farm because of some climate related issue, but also a development related issue, that they just built something upstream of the farm and that contributed to the demise, it's a lot easier to have a discussion about things that include environmental issues at that level. Is that really what you're getting at?
Yeah, I think what I'm getting at is anytime you can put yourself in a situation where you're having an honest and open conversation with someone that you disagree with on politics, one that has empathy as a basis, as opposed to just a situation where you're trying to convince someone to take the position you're taking, that can be a really constructive and moderating force. And I think where with climate change, you're right in that when you can talk about immediate impacts, it makes it a lot easier when you're talking about concrete things to understand where other people are coming from. I think part of the issue of climate change is the sort of abstract nature of the discussion and the debate. And oftentimes, one thing you heard a lot in the media up until a couple of years ago, and you still hear to some degree today, is, well, a hurricane occurred and we can't say that this is occurring because of climate change. What we can say is that more hurricanes are occurring because of climate change than we used to have. But in the state of North Carolina, one of the big issues we're running into with climate change is the erosion of beaches and eventually beachfront property, things of that nature. And when you can start to talk about what is involved there, how much it's going to cost to pump sand from the bottom of the ocean onto these beaches on a continuous basis in order to keep the land there, that's a very real and immediate thing. So
we're talking again to Professor Rob Shrode, assistant professor of political science at University of North Carolina, Asheville. We're talking about the impact of increasing polarization in politics and how that's affecting the way we approach various topics, various subjects. Instead of getting into the meat of the subject, there's a lot of finger pointing, yelling, screaming, insurrection, and havoc, and that, whether we've always had it to some extent or didn't have it, that can't be a good thing in terms of our political system. We're supposed to have a political system that allows for reasonable discourse, which allows people to disagree civilly, and which allows people to express their views at the ballot box, and also express their views before various agencies. And it seems like that again is suffering as a result of the identity politics and the polarization and stagnation in terms of moving forward on some basis with legislation that's positive. But I want to ask you about that. I want to take an example. It seems like the polarization is so strong along party lines that people are voting for a person or a party against their own interests. I'll use one example that's relevant here in North Carolina, but also several other states, and that is this concept of Medicaid expansion. The beneficiaries of Medicaid expansion would be people who don't fit into the poverty level established by the government to get Medicaid, but nonetheless can't afford their health care. And that could be people that live in rural areas. It could be people that live in urban, suburban, whatever, that just, can't do it. And yet at a local level or state level, they haven't been able to turn that corner, even though there's been talk about it in every election, that there needs to be a change in that. How is it that people are so stratified or polarized that they can't identify that this is a policy that they would like, and they should be voting in the direction of which politician or which political party is in favor of that? It seems pretty clear in North Carolina, Republican Party is generally against it, and the Democratic Party is generally in favor of it.
So I can't speak specifically to North Carolina, but what I would say is, as someone who studies public opinion, one of the things that I learned at one point is that I think people usually have reasons for why they're doing what they're doing. And I try to kind of respect the reasoning and then try to figure out what the reasoning is, as opposed to thinking about it in terms of voting against their own self-interest, that sort of thing. I grew up in a Republican family where that argument was made. I heard a lot of elders make the argument that if Black people wouldn't vote as a bloc, then they would be benefited politically. And then I went to grad school and I heard a bunch of people, and this is actually how I thought of things at first, about how working class whites would benefit by voting for the Democratic Party, and yet to some degree they don't. What I would say is Medicaid expansion under Obamacare is a very specific example where I think it's very clear that the federal government already took the money from your state. They're willing to give it back. It doesn't just help people who have Medicare or would qualify under Medicaid expansion, but it also benefits local communities because that money is spent at your local hospital, which puts money in the hands of nurses, medical technicians, and they go out to local restaurants and they eat and they buy clothes locally and all those things. So that said, I do think that we're getting to a point where these party cues are so strong that at the end of the day, you really are seeing partisanship short circuit that process.
So we just have we have about 5 minutes left. Let me expand a little bit on this concept and talk about something that's present day, which is the efforts largely by Democrats to pass infrastructure. And the infrastructure legislation that's been hanging around for weeks, if not months, includes a bipartisan bill that got bipartisan support, meaning the Republicans supported it, because some of the monies were going to be used on so-called hard infrastructure, meaning even a diehard Republican politician was not going to deny money to build or rebuild a bridge that was likely to fall apart and kill people. But to the extent that the Democrats thought they could expand the concept of infrastructure to include social infrastructure, like childcare, like universal pre-K, like climate change, that's, to use the metaphor, a bridge too far. And yet, I don't know if there's been any polls that you can rely upon, but it looks like a lot of people, probably a sizable majority of people, feel like a lot of these so-called soft infrastructure things are useful. But the way that it has been discussed in these polarized times is it's too much money. We don't need to spend over $3 trillion, even though it's over 10 years, even though we spend a ton more than that on the military. And what one might argue has that gotten us in terms of the wars that we've got ourselves embroiled in. And yet, again, because of the way politics is working in these polarized times, Republicans have not shown any inclination that they could support any of that. Why are they not? I mean, have they been able to manipulate their constituency, or has the constituency bought off on the idea that if the Democrats are doing it and it involves spending more money, it must not be a good idea? Do you have a sense of that?
I mean, I would tend to probably side more with the latter argument. Certainly, though, I think the thing to keep in mind with this infrastructure bill, or soft infrastructure bill, is that we're still talking about an amount after it's almost been halved now, that we're discussing about. It's still almost twice the size of the stimulus that Obama managed to pass in order to help us recover from the recession that started in 2008. And so within that context, I think it's still a very large and ambitious piece of legislation. It tries to do a whole lot of things. And so I think that makes it a tough sell. Because if you pass pieces of legislation that address specific issues one by one, and I understand that might not work from sort of if you look at the way Congress works and the rules of Congress, it might be impossible to do that. But you can actually then sell the public on these issues. The problem is, I think this has become a real messaging problem for the Democrats. As is typical when it takes a while to pass a piece of legislation, the majority of coverage focuses on not the what of the legislation, but on the how of the political process to pass it. Nobody wants to eat the sausage after they've seen it made. And that's what we're seeing right now with this bill. And I think that's, there's a decent chance the Democrats still get something substantial passed. But this is a very different strategy than, say, the New Deal pieces of legislation that were really sold to the public one by one in many cases.
Okay. Well, we're coming to the end. I want to thank my guest today, Professor Rob Shrode, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. Thank you for a very informative discussion, and love to see you back on the show again.
Thank you. It was great to be here.